Lesson 2.4.2 Black Resistance. Free Northern blacks and their enslaved Southern brethren participated in personal as well as organized acts of resistance against slavery. In the North, African Americans faced huge odds and the systematic violation of their civil liberties. Consequently, many fervently supported the abolitionist cause with both open and surreptitious acts of rebellion. Northern blacks began forming groups to support the cause for freedom. As early as 1817, black Philadelphians formally protested African colonization, and by the late 1820s, black participation in anti-slavery societies had proliferated throughout the northeastern United States. Abolitionist newspapers, such as William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator, funded abolitionist activities, thanks to the consistent and generous financial support of black activists, who made up the majority of the paper's subscribers in its early critical years. Former slaves and descendants of slaves also published their own newspapers to deliver powerful testimonies against slavery, at the risk of being enslaved themselves. The likelihood of enslavement and death was extremely high for foot soldiers on the Underground Railroad. Helping runaways who had slave hunters on their heels was a perilous business, but the possibility of liberty in their eyes was well worth the threat of death. Enslaved blacks conducted personal protests against their own forced labor. Many broke tools, slowed their work pace, pretended ignorance, and in some cases engaged in violence against their masters. A few worked and saved money to buy freedom for themselves and for their loved ones, while others used the most common form of resistance, escape. For those who had reached the limit of endurance, violent insurrection was the answer. The Underground Railroad. On numerous journeys into southern slave territories, the fearless ex-slave Harriet Tubman led over 200 people to freedom, including her parents. Her dangerous work was so successful that Southerners placed a $40,000 bounty on her head. Today, she is widely recognized as the Underground Railroad's most successful conductor. Tubman's activities were not limited to perilous rescues. She also recruited black soldiers for the Union Army and actively aided Union troops, a job that went uncompensated. Tubman devoted the rest of her life to charitable work on behalf of former slaves and converted her Auburn, New York home into a sanitarium for the old and poor. William Wells Brown. Born a Kentucky slave, William Wells Brown used his oratorical skills as a lecturer for both the American Anti-Slavery Society and the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society to spread the abolitionist message. In 1847, Brown published the first edition of his narrative of William W. Brown, a fugitive slave, written by himself. This slave narrative sold more than 13,000 copies in 6 editions in the United States and England. In 1849, he traveled abroad and began lecturing in England, where he remained until 1854. Brown was a prolific writer, publishing an autobiography, a travel book, a book of abolitionist songs, a play, novels, and a history of black people. Brown is perhaps best remembered today as a pioneer in African American literature. Clotel, the first novel published by an African American, was the work of his pen. Clotel is a fictionalized account of Thomas Jefferson's relationship with his slave, Sally Hemings, first published in 1853. Henry Highland Garnet. Henry Highland Garnet was the first African American to speak before the House of Representatives and one of the founders of the American and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society. At first an advocate of moral suasion, or the use of lecturing and moral persuasion to sway public opinion, he later turned his attention to political lobbying. At the National Negro Convention in 1843 in Albany, New York, Garnet's growing militancy became apparent in a controversial speech. His An Address to the Slaves of the United States of America called for slaves to free themselves. Disheartened by the hostile treatment of blacks in America, Garnet took a stance unpopular among black activists by supporting African colonization. He spent the last months of his life as minister to Liberia, a country in West Africa colonized by American ex-slaves and black freemen. Samuel Ringgold Ward. Samuel Ringgold Ward, an escaped slave, became the pastor of two all-white congregations in South Butler and Cortland, New York. In 1834, he was attacked by a pro-slavery mob of New York merchants and was jailed without accuser or trial. From then on, he committed himself to the anti-slavery cause. In 1851, fearing arrest for his part in a slave rescue, Ward escaped to Canada, where he continued to work as an anti-slavery agent. Ward used his powerful oratorical skills overseas and lived the remainder of his life in Jamaica, free from the constant threat of arrest. Slave purchased and freed by her mother. This document alludes to the poignant story of Nancy Richardson, a mother who worked diligently and ultimately purchased freedom for her enslaved daughter, Floria Barnes. This testimony legally certifies that Floria Barnes, a Negro woman, now before me in the identical Negro woman who was heretofore purchased by her mother, Nancy Richardson, and who was by the said Nancy Richardson manumitted and set free. Runaway slave notices are some of the earliest clues we have as to the interior lives of slaves living in New York during the 18th and 19th century. These notices often reveal the ethnicity, work culture, languages spoken, and appearances of enslaved Africans. Often, a slave's religious beliefs as well as personal habits were noted. The greatest amount of information found in runaway notices is the outerwear worn by slaves. The clothing stated in these notices reflected the deprived existences they led. Slave masters recall styles of clothing, including the color and material the clothing was made of, hairstyles, and types of headwear in great detail. This was crucial information since most fugitive slaves ran away with only one set of clothes. Some of the comments made by masters in these ads reflect the mistreatment of their slaves. In this notice, Alexander Colden, grandson of Cadwallader Colden, governor of New York, mentions that his slave Peter fled precipitately from his work in fear of a deserved correction. One can only surmise what the term correction might entail. Through runaway slave notices, we are able to form individual and group portraits of 18th and 19th century African American slaves. We find restless, tired young men and women fed up with the psychological and physical maltreatment they were forced to endure as enslaved people. The AMISTAD. In 1839, Joseph Singue led a bloody revolt on the slave ship AMISTAD, which had embarked from Cuba. Under the control of Singue and his fellow Africans, the crew secretly sailed to Long Island, New York, instead of to Sierra Leone, where they were supposed to return. On arrival in New York, the Africans were arrested and charged with murder and piracy. The sensational trial that followed went all the way to the Supreme Court, where the defendants were represented by the former U.S. President John Quincy Adams. In 1841, the Supreme Court ruled that the Africans were illegally incarcerated and that they must be returned to Africa, which they were the following year. Insurrections. This pamphlet features accounts of two slave insurrections. The first account, published by Charleston authorities, describes the massive but unsuccessful slave insurrection in Charleston, South Carolina. The insurrection was led by the freed slave Denmark Vesey in 1822 and was foiled by a slave. The second account tells the story of the Virginian slave Nat Turner, who, led by divine visions, planned and carried out a bloody and far-reaching uprising. Turner and his army of about 75 other slaves murdered at least 57 whites before they were stopped by a mob of about 3,000 who either killed or arrested the rebellious slaves. Those captured, including Turner himself, were later tried and hanged. Douglas Monthly ran from 1858 to 1863. It was one of 4 papers published by Frederick Douglass, all of them dedicated to abolitionism and social reform. This August 1862 issue celebrates the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia.